Hello everyone and welcome to today's Mondac webinar in association with Bremer, who will be exploring the current practices and imminent developments in merger control landscape in the MENA region. My name is Dan Sampaio and I'm joined by a brilliant speaker today to take us through our discussion. Nicholas Bremer is a partner of the regional law firm Bremer, where he heads the firm's antitrust and merger control and mergers and acquisitions teams. He oversees the firm's Riyadh and Cairo representations. He specializes in advising on merger control and antitrust matters, as well as mergers and acquisitions transactions in the MENA region, and Egypt, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia in particular. Nicholas advises international corporates and private equity firms on merger control and antitrust matters, mergers and acquisitions transactions, and joint ventures. Now, before I hand over to Nicholas to begin today's webinar, a housekeeping item. You can submit questions to Nicholas by typing them into the questions pane of the toolbar on the right-hand side of your page, and we'll endeavour to answer as many of those questions as possible during our Q&A session towards the end of the presentation. It's now my pleasure to hand you over to Nicholas to begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And hello, everyone. As Dan already said, we're going to talk about new developments in merger control in the MENA region, specifically Saudi Arabia and Egypt, because we've seen most development there recently. Kuwait has been quite low in regulatory changes recently, and after we saw new thresholds introduced earlier this year in Morocco, there has not really been that much, but Saudi Arabia and Egypt are currently moving a lot. That's why we're focusing a bit on this. If you could go to the next slide. And just generally looking first at Saudi Arabia, where we very recently had new thresholds introduced that also have effects for the local effects test. Also, there's been an increase over the past 18 months in enforcement activity, and so personnel shift in the authority has affected review times. After that, we're going to look at Egypt, the current situation, as well as the pending new pre-closing notification regime. I'm going to go a bit through the basics, what we know so far, and an outlook as to what we can say about when it will enter into force. If you could go to the next slide. Just very briefly, I'm not going to go into detail on the regimes themselves, but rather just focus on what is new and what is developing. But Saudi Arabia, essentially active since end of September 2019. Prior to that, there was a competition law, there was merger control review, but it was much less aggressive, so largely a dormant jurisdiction up to that date. And then, as I said, this year, actually this month, we had some more recent developments. Egypt, traditionally post-closing notification regime, end of last year shifted to a pre-closing notification regime. There are some issues currently, questions about enforcement, as well as to timeline when the next regime will come into force. If you could go to the next slide. The most recent development in the region, actually, and in Saudi Arabia, is the new thresholds for notification that were introduced that happened earlier this month. Very much unexpected for pretty much everybody. There was no prior notification. There was no announcement that there were going to be changes to this. And then on 2nd of November, the thresholds were announced. On about 5 days later, we got an updated version of the Saudi merger guidelines that then went into a little bit more detail. Essentially, what is new is that in addition to the combined worldwide threshold, we now have a minimum requirement for the target and a minimum Saudi turnover requirement. Immediately, that raised some questions that then have been further addressed in the guidelines, and also we had a couple of discussions with staff from the authority on this. Concerning is that all of these thresholds, except of course for the minimum target turnover threshold that has to be met by the target, but essentially all of these can be met by one party. Meaning we could potentially have filings where the target does not have turnover in Saudi Arabia, and the local turnover requirement is just met by the acquirer. In addition, the Saudi authority GAC has stated that they would not apply the minimum target turnover requirement to joint venture formations. So greenfield joint ventures are caught. And lastly, the minimum Saudi turnover threshold appears not to apply strictly to foreign transactions. If you could go to the next slide. And this last point, that we have questions about how the minimum Saudi turnover requirement applies to foreign transactions, leads us to the local nexus test. Essentially, the local nexus test will only be applied to foreign transactions. So if we have a domestic transaction, the three different thresholds determine whether notification is required. If change of control occurs, then and the thresholds are met, a notification must be made. With foreign transactions, it's a little bit different, as there still remains a local effects test that was now confirmed in the guidelines. And essentially, the 40 million Saudi Riyal local or domestic turnover in Saudi Arabia for foreign transactions is not a threshold as so much as a hard border where the authority will deem a transaction to have a local effect. Meaning, if one of the parties to the transaction or multiple parties combined have at least 40 million Saudi Riyal turnover in the kingdom, the transaction will be deemed to have a local effect in Saudi Arabia. There does not have to be an overlap of those turnovers. Their target does not necessarily have to have turnover in Saudi Arabia. Essentially, the acquirer alone could meet that threshold. If the parties together have less than 40 million Saudi Riyal turnover in Saudi Arabia, the transaction might still be deemed to have a local effect if other factors make that reasonable in the view of the authority. We don't have that much experience with this new threshold yet. It's effectively enforced for just under a month. We had a couple of filings already, but we don't really have that much feedback from the authority in practice yet. What we can say, though, from prior application of the old local effects test under the old thresholds, the Saudi authority has tended to look at a couple of factors that would be considered competition related, such as effects on global supply and distribution, potential future market entry of the target, when they would assess whether there is a local effect, and we assume that they would continue to apply these. But in addition, they have always looked at some factors that we would rather consider to be FDI related issues, such as sensitivity of a specific sector, transactions involving so-called hostile nations, meaning countries that for political or strategic reasons Saudi Arabia might have an issue with investing in certain, and specifically in sensitive sectors, where all of these factors may be considered when they determine whether a transaction where that does not meet the local turnover requirement, whether that still should be deemed to have a local effect and be called in or be required to make a notification. The last factor that has popped up from time to time is third-party sales through independent persons, meaning not distributors officially engaged. Distributor sales will be counted as turnover of the principal under Saudi law, but unrelated third parties, so in the automotive sector, for example, used car sellers, sales from such unrelated persons could also be considered as something that establishes a local effect of a transaction. Somewhat uncommon internationally because it's sort of a very broad application, but these are factors that we have seen in the past. Again, that was under the old thresholds and a slightly different local effects test. However, going forward, we would expect them to also continue to consider these or similar factors. As I said, we still have very little experience with the new thresholds. However, in the filings that we have made so far under the new regime, it seems that the case handlers are going or are mostly influenced by the 40 million Saudi threshold, and we had a couple of transactions that were cleared without full review, with the argument that the turnover is below 40 million Saudi Riyal. These were foreign-to-foreign transactions. So the application of this second criterion, that other means could establish a local effect, has so far not been applied to our knowledge. It remains to be seen how aggressively the Saudi authorities will pursue this and implement this. Next slide, please. Then, paired with this sort of ambiguity that we have currently, what raises some concerns is increased enforcement for parties, of course. There has been quite little activity until 2022. Not that surprising. The regime effectively entered into force end of September 2019, and we would expect a new regime with a new regime, we would expect to see violations cases only sometime afterwards. Towards the end of 2020, it has really started to pick up, and by the end of 2020, this is the last date where we have official numbers. The 2013 numbers, 2023 numbers are not out yet. We saw a total of 15 gun jumping fines being issued, about 50 plus settlements, meaning violations that were discovered, were found to be violations, but ultimately not penalized by fines, but settled. The issue was settled with the parties. One issue with the enforcement practice in Saudi Arabia is lack of transparency in both the full sort of violations procedures as well as the settlement procedures. The settlement procedures are by design intransparent. Part of the benefit for parties to enter into settlement negotiations is that they will not be named, that the transaction and the perceived violations will not be published, Also, settlement amounts will not be published, although in their annual report, the Saudi authority publishes average settlement amounts. And for the year 2022, again, that's the last report that we have, these were in average $150,000 US. When it comes to the violation procedures, the law and the regulations actually provide for a shaming sanction, meaning publication of the violation as well as the violating party, or naming the violating parties, is built into the regime as part of the penalties. However, out of the 15 gun jumping fines that were, according to the official statements issued by the end of 2022, only 4 cases were actually published with the parties being named. We know that 6 out of the 15 cases involve foreign-to-foreign transactions, so there are enforcement activities against foreign transactions, or have been until 2022. And we are aware from the 4 cases that were published, as well as our involvement in other cases and official report from the authority, that quite consistently the fines had been 10 million Saudi riyal for first-time offenses. To our knowledge, there have not been second-time offenses or cases involving second-time offenses yet. 10 million Saudi riyal comes to roughly 2.6 million US dollars. So we can say there is enforcement activity. It is increasing. It has significantly increased over 2022. How it looks, we're going to see another increase in 2023, but the official numbers are not yet. Transparency is lacking, not just in terms of the motivations for the authority to allow settlement for certain perceived violations and going for full violation procedure for others. What standards are applied has not been made transparent. There are some indications as to that in the guidelines, but we don't have case law precedents to follow that up. And also we don't have a good understanding of how fines are calculated, specifically in the violations proceedings, where they seem to be very consistently around this number, 10 million Saudi riyal. It seems that they sort of have a standard initial fine. In the settlement procedures, they seem to be fluctuating somewhat more, the settlement amounts, and it is also not entirely clear how this fluctuation occurs, or what the reasons for GAC to take different settlement amounts into consideration is explained. Next slide, please. The review process in Saudi Arabia, especially in the beginning of 2019, was a concern for a lot of parties, that it has been rather slow. The official statutory review time is 90 calendar days as of the authority determining that the filing is complete and the filing fees paid. Consistently, even in the beginning, we saw rather quicker turnaround numbers. The authority, unlike, for example, in the US, where we have a waiting period, in Saudi Arabia, the authority actively clears transactions, and often a lot quicker than the 90 days that they would have. However, end of last year, beginning of this year, there were a number of experienced case handlers and investigators that left the authority, and this has had a noticeable effect on review times as well as investigation procedures. While around the end of 2022, review times were rather short. In no to limited issues cases, we saw review times of 20 to 30 business days as of initial submission. So that would include the pre-review phase as well as the review phase. Currently, that has extended to about 30 to 45 business days on average. So regrettably, a slowdown. It also has, we've also have seen case handlers to be more likely to call in transactions. So if presented with a transaction and asked to comment on whether they would deem these notifiable or not, there has been an increased tendency to call in transactions, which might also be related to younger case handlers having a little bit less experience and being more careful in making a call on a transaction. We will have to see how this plays out with the new thresholds, since we now have this very clear sort of local cut line, local turnover cut line of 40 million Saudi Riyal that case handlers can rely on. And but in the month that this new threshold has been applied so far, it is somewhat difficult to make a statement yet. In investigative procedures, we have seen just in how investigations were run, how questions were asked, what elements case handlers or investigators were focusing on, also a little bit of a drop, probably related to us having to deal with much less experienced investigators in many transactions. That raises some concerns, specifically because appeals processes and challenging decisions is quite difficult in Saudi Arabia. So the outcome of the initial investigation and this is very significant. Overall, we were probably set back by about 12 months in development when it comes to sort of the processes at the authority. There is increased training. We are aware that they hired new outside advisors also. So we're hopeful that this is a temporary setback and that we will get to quicker review times as well as more professional conduct of the processes soon. But this is the situation we're in right now. Next slide, please. Coming to Egypt now, the current situation is a little bit complicated. Essentially, in end of last year, the Egyptian legislature passed an amendment to the competition law that abandoned the then current post-closing notification regime and replaced it with a pre-closing notification regime. The implementation of the law occurred on 30th of December 2022, and the law became effective immediately. So it was issued on 29th and then became effective on the 30th. However, at that point, there were large parts of the procedure still entirely unclear. The executive regulations that had not been amended in parallel were in parts conflicting with the law. And also the authority didn't appear ready to apply a pre-closing notification merger control regime at that point. And on 4th of January 2023, there was an announcement from the ECA, the Egyptian Competition Authority, that they would not enforce the new regime until the executive regulations to the competition law were amended. Initially, there was some confusion as to what would happen now to the post-closing regime in the meantime. as it stands right now, we have clarity that there is no mandatory filing under the old regime. The new regime is not applied yet. And it will be, they will start to enforce it once the amended executive regulations are issued. Two problems with this and the current situation. There is very little transparency as to when these executive regulations will come out. There were no official statements from the authority as to a date, but some unofficial dates have been provided or leaked over the past year. About 3 times we had very concrete dates that we were told. They were never held. Currently, we don't have any guidance on the issue. However, looking at the situation in Egypt right now, presidential elections are coming up in mid-December. Runoff elections, if necessary, are planned for mid of January. So we are not expecting the executive regulations to be issued this year. And reasonably, after presidential elections, we would not expect them to be issued very quickly afterwards either. But we don't have any guidance from the authority on that. And it remains speculative right now to make up a guideline. This ambiguity as to when the regulations will come out is particularly problematic in Egypt because the authority and the legislator are very clear that any transaction that is not closed by the date on which the executive regulations enter into force will be court by the regime, meaning potentially, and looking at how quickly, basically without grace period, the law came into force, we might face a situation where the executive regulations come into force days before transaction might close, and that transaction being caught by the new regime, which would obviously put hardships on the parties, specifically in larger transactions and in transactions that might not have relevant exposure to Egypt. There might be lack of understanding of the parties that they would have to file the transaction now in Egypt that closely before closing and observe a standstill obligation. We're tracking this actively, and we're trying to keep our clients and law firms that we work with appraised on any developments, but right now there's just very little tangible information out there. Next slide, please. The new pre-closing notification regime in Egypt, just in a nutshell or in a short overview, is it is mandatory. It includes the standstill obligation. It changed the notification thresholds quite significantly. Essentially, there's 2 different tracks. One where multiple parties are considered, one where one party alone can meet the thresholds. Multiple party track requires all parties to the transaction together to have at least $30 million in worldwide annual turnover, or worldwide value of their assets. It has to be at least $30 million, and at least 2 parties to the transactions have to have a turnover in Saudi Arabia of 200 million Egyptian pounds, so roughly about $6.7 million in Egypt. The numbers are shifting quite a bit because after these thresholds were announced, there was a devaluation of the Egyptian pound. We expect there to be a second one, so these thresholds might get significantly smaller, and we don't have any information on them being adjusted. The more problematic threshold for us as advisors right now is the one-party lag threshold. That basically requires that one party has at least what would now convert to $250 million annual turnover worldwide, plus at least approximately $6.7 million turnover in Egypt. Under the law, it looks like, and the authority appears to take that position, is that this could be the acquirer meeting this threshold. So meaning potentially in Egypt we might see obligations of companies to file transactions where the target has no business in Egypt. There is no local nexus test in addition to this. There is no requirement of overlap between the parties' revenues or businesses. So potentially we might come into a situation where transactions that have very little or no relevance for Egypt falling under the new regime. Again, we have not seen a final version of the amended executive regulations. There was no local nexus test under the old post-closing regime. However, we have seen, or it is an entirely different regime that we're dealing with right now. So there are still some hopes that with the executive regulations, a local nexus corrective would be implemented. However, it does not look like that right now from what we hear of the authority. And it would also not be unusual in the region. Morocco has a very similar threshold. Also, these sort of split into multi-party requirements and single-party requirements, and also does not seem to apply the local effects test that they had established in 2022. So it would not be out of the norm if there's no local effects test implemented. And that, again, paired with this ambiguity as to when the regime will actually become live and it applying to any transactions not closed before then, raises concerns when it comes to Egypt as a merger control jurisdiction going forward. Next slide, please. When, I mean, as I said, we don't have that much information yet on the procedure, but some elements are already included in the amendments to the competition law. Specifically, we already know that we will have a review procedure divided in 2 phases, so somewhat similar to the European model. Phase 1, when I have 30 business days statutory review time, maybe amended by 15 days. In phase 2, or the phase 2 would be additionally 60 days with the option of the authority to amend by 15 days. What we don't have yet are guidelines on how the authority would determine when a transaction would be moved from phase 1 to phase 2. Essentially, all the competition law as issued in December 2022 says to that matter is if the authority finds competition concerns, they would move it to phase 2 and conduct a phase 2 review. But we have no information and no further clarification of what competition concerns in that regard means. We also do not have any procedural guidelines on how a phase 2 review would be conducted. The review deadline of 60 business days for phase 2 review seems rather aggressive. If we look in other jurisdictions, phase 2 review can take a lot more time. However, we would expect the authority to have the right to suspend the clock or stop the clock during the review process. So if they might face issues with completing their review in the review time, there would be mechanisms for them to extend the review time even beyond those 15 additional days that they can do under the statutes, simply by stopping the clock. If they wanted to conduct a more thorough investigation, it might be necessary. However, as per the statutes, we have these review times right now. Also from the law, we know that there will be a specific appeals process. The parties will have 30 business days after the decision is issued to appeal against the decision of the ECA. We do not have clarity on how this process will function in practice. Is really just the mention in the law. Also, with the new regime, the Egyptian merger control regime for the first time will have a filing fee. Under the post-closing regime, there was no filing fee. Now the filing fee is capped at 100,000 Egyptian pounds. Currently, that is around 3.3 thousand US dollars. Again, this filing fee was issued prior to the most recent devaluation of the Egyptian pound. So there is a possibility of this being amended again. Prior to the devaluation, the amount was just under 5,000 US dollars. So not a significant filing fee cap at that point either. However, we might, considering the devaluation now and the second devaluation we're expecting to occur after the presidential election, there may be some adjustment. And also the law provides the framework of a penalties catalog. It includes fines between 1% and 10% of annual asset value or turnover, whichever is higher. What the law does not specify, and what we have not gotten clarity on from the authority, is whether the calculation is based on worldwide or domestic turnover or asset values. And we also do not have guidance on whether there's in fact a minimum fine of 1% of annual turnover, or if the authority has discretion to settle cases or waive a fine in certain cases. Other fines have not been introduced yet under the old regime. There were possibilities of daily fines, business closures, voiding of transactions. These might be introduced with the executive regulations, and criminal sanctions have, under the old regime and under the general antitrust regime in Egypt, are a possibility, and we would expect that to continue under the new regime. That concludes my presentation of the two other newest developments in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Feel free, if you have any questions, to address them through the chat function. Happy to respond to anything. Also, if it goes beyond what we talked about or goes more generally into the regimes.
Excellent, thank you, Nicholas. And I echo your words. If you do have a question, please do send it in. We'll be able to get that question answered for you. We have a couple already, but before we move on to the Q&A, I just wanted to say thank you very much, Nick, for that presentation and an incredible amount of information and detail that you provided us today. So we really do appreciate that. Our first question, how does the Saudi authority treat private equity acquirers? Which entities and funds will they consider when assessing whether the thresholds are met and when making their assessment?
PE acquirers are still a little bit of an issue in Saudi Arabia. In the beginning, I mean, it stems from the fact that Saudi Arabia just, from its legal system, doesn't have the potential to build up a PE structure. Nobody really has an interest in building a PE structure under, or fund structure under, Saudi law. So this concept of a company controlling a bunch of portfolio companies or several portfolio companies that they don't hold any shares in is just foreign to them. And that translates into problems. There are no guidelines as to treat them. We have typically taken a more narrow approach so that we would focus on the acquiring fund, look at the portfolio companies in there, and on the top level, so considering all funds under management, we would just inform the authority if there are any entities there that are competitors to the target, so if there's an overlap. That has consistently been accepted as permissible, and we have always made that restriction transparent to them, so in order not to get into any issues of them potentially claiming that we withheld information. However, that practice has never been sanctioned or implemented in regulations and guidelines. So currently, yeah, we can say much more similar to the US system, looking at the acquiring fund and overlap over the entire controlled funds, as opposed to the EU model that would just look at all funds. However, that is just practice and not solidified in regulations yet.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nick. Our second question, does the Saudi authority require parties to disclose prior transactions in the review process?
Not officially. So in the filing forms, there's no question that would address that. For example, Kuwait has that in their filing forms. There you have to disclose all transactions closed in the last 3 years prior to the transaction. Saudi Arabia doesn't have that. However, recently in 2 transactions, we have gotten questions from the case handler on prior transactions. The first one involved an acquirer that for a different transaction was had an inquiry into a prior transaction that was conducted by the investigative department of GAC. So at that time, we saw it as likely related to the inquiry that they would pose that question in the filing process. However, as I said, we had a second transaction where they asked the same question, which leaves us with a little bit less confidence that this was just related to the fact that in the other transaction there was an inquiry into the or it involved an acquirer that had an inquiry into a different transaction. However, also we had other filings since then where we haven't been asked that question. So I do appreciate that is maybe not the most satisfying answer, but the honest answer is we don't know right now. We have been asked this question recently. Since that was for us the first time since 2019 they started the regime. But we haven't been asked this in every transaction, and also it has not made its way into the filing form. So these might be outliers, but it's something to consider.
No, I think that was a fantastic answer. Thank you very much, Nick. Now, I think some of the questions we have coming up, you may have touched on a few aspects of those throughout the presentation, but it's always good to give a sort of overview and a recap if needed. We have had this question in, and this was from Wasim, who asked, which authority is responsible to approve M&A schemes in the MENA region? Is it the courts or is it other government authorities? And I don't know if there's any sort of added information you want to give around that, Nick.
I mean, the merger review is conducted by specific competition authorities, at least in in the 4 jurisdictions that we are most engaged in, which would be Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Kuwait, and Morocco, which are the active jurisdictions in the Arab Middle East. The courts may play a role when it comes to penalties. Fines are typically issued, for example, in Saudi Arabia, they're issued by the authority directly, but certain other sanctions or penalties would have to be imposed by the courts. In Egypt, the courts play a more important role in the penalty process, specifically, and when it comes to criminal sanctions, they're always involved. However, the actual approval process in all 4 jurisdictions is within the authority of the competition authorities.
Brilliant, thanks, Nick. And finally, we've had this question from Fawaz, who asked, an international company sells in 2 different countries with big differences in prices. Would that be a violation?
That generally not. That very much depends on the market conditions. I mean, obviously it's suspicious. And if these are very similar countries, similar population setup, similar market conditions, availability of supplies, purchasing power, etc., low labor costs, then that would be suspicious. If these are very different, or that might very well be a violation at that point. If it is, if there are reasonable grounds for companies to put different pricing in the market, in different markets, it could be related to import duties. It could be related to any manner of factors. So it's not really a question I can give a straightforward answer to. Like, it might be a violation of fair pricing. It might be indicative of maybe the company using a dominant market position in the market where they sell at higher prices. But at the face of it, it's not a violation yet. There is a variety of factors that might explain that.
Understood.
And also ultimately, I mean, competition law does not require companies to sell at the same price in every country. I mean, they can adjust it. There would have to be other issues that make it a violation.
Exactly. And I would ask Fawaz, if you have a bit more context, perhaps to go with that question, please do reach out. Give Nick, you can see Nick's contact information there. Please do reach out after this. And that goes for everybody in the audience today. If you have a question that perhaps you don't want to ask on the webinar, but you do want to get in touch, contact information is there, and we will reach out after the webinar to you with Nick's contact information, with the slides and the recording. So please do share that with anybody you think would benefit from seeing it. I'm looking through the chat, and I don't think we have any other questions from the audience. As I say, please do send in questions if needed, but it may be the case that we'll be finishing a few minutes early. But before we leave, Nick, I wanted to ask you if there were any key takeaways that you would like our audience to leave today's webinar with.
I mean, the Middle East is a merger control, or multiple merger control jurisdictions, of course, because we don't have a centralized system, is new in this. So a lot of companies might not have that on their radar that much. But if we look at enforcement activity, and for example, in Saudi Arabia and Egypt, the ECA is a quite skilled investigator when it comes to antitrust and behavioral matters. So we would expect them to start enforcement much more aggressively than the Saudis maybe did in the beginning when the new regime comes in. There is a threat there. So if there's an exposure to those countries, it should be something to consider. On the other hand, what you do have to consider if you go into a major merger control review in the region, and specifically if it's a complex transaction, these are developing jurisdictions in that regard. So the process will not be as straightforward as it would be in more established jurisdictions. The authorities just simply don't have the institutional experience that the FTC, DOJ, European Commission, or other more experienced regulators have. So it is a region that you have to look out for, even in foreign-to-foreign transact or foreign-to-foreign to that region. However, you do have to consider that we're dealing with emerging jurisdictions, and there might be challenges that arise from that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Nick. I think that's an excellent place to conclude today's webinar. Thank you very much again, Nick, for your expertise, your insights today. We truly appreciate it. It's been a pleasure to spend 50 minutes, an hour in your company today on this webinar. Thank you also to our audience for being with us today, for those questions that you've submitted. As I say, please do get in touch for any additional information you may need from Nick. We'll be in touch with that contact information and a few different follow-ups. But have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.